Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Texas Public Policy Foundation's weekly live stream, where we cover the issues pressing America. Obviously, most of you tune in from outside the state of Texas, and so it's fitting that as we cover this issue facing every single state and our entire country, that is elections and the transparency and integrity of them, that we have one of the great patriots of our generation joining us, and that's Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. Senator Paul, thanks so much for taking time out of what I know is a very busy schedule this week for this conversation.
Good morning. Yeah, thanks a lot for having me.
Yes, you bet. So folks tuning in, if we've not met, I'm Kevin Roberts, the host of this show and CEO of the foundation. Senator Paul will cut straight to it because, as our audience members know, this issue of election reform is a pressing issue in almost every legislature that's meeting, including ours in Texas, just 2 blocks up the street from where I'm this morning. And then also, of course, in Washington, D.C. And before we get into some of the specific legislation, sir, I just want to pitch you the proverbial 30,000-foot question, or at least one of them, and that is, we hear the prevailing narrative from the media that voter fraud is a myth, that conservatives' concerns about integrity of elections is just overwrought in a myth. What's your response to that?
I think no one can deny that the last election was an extraordinary one. I don't think we've ever had an election like it. We had more mailed-in ballots than we've ever had. And I think inherently it's harder to validate or prove that someone is who they say they are through the mail than it is in person presenting an ID. So I think the election was extraordinary. And the legal cases leading up to it were also extraordinary. Most of your listeners will probably agree that our rights are ours, they pre-exist government. The presumption is for liberty, and the government has to prove that somehow, they've gotten power either from the Constitution or from the people somehow by statute. But what happened in the election cases leading up to the election was that secretaries of state and governors began doing things they had not been given power to do by the state legislature. So you had secretaries of state mailing out absentee ballots. You had them also mailing out applications for ballots and basically soliciting voters. When the cases went to court, the court, in an upside down fashion, decided, well, if you didn't tell them they couldn't do it, then we will presume that they can. This turns constitutional government on its head, because really we've always believed that the only powers your government has are what are given to them, the enumerated powers. And most of your listeners are familiar. The 9th and 10th Amendment say those rights or those powers not granted to Congress are left to the states and the people. But this is a really big deal. And I tell people that it's not just about preventing dead people from voting, although we should all be unified in that, or preventing illegal aliens or preventing people from voting twice. All of those are important. But even more important is that election officials, either at the state or even at the county level, cannot assume powers that were not given to them. And so I've advocated from the very beginning, right after the November election, I began speaking to legislators through ALEC, speaking to individual state legislators, speaking to governors and saying, this is the issue. We cannot have fair elections if we allow people to harvest elections and harvest votes. And it should be one person, one vote, but not one person. I can bring in 100,000 votes and drop them off at the poll. That is something different entirely, and I think does open us up to fraud. People on the left say, well, how do you prove there was fraud? There wasn't, there's no proof of fraud, and the courts 60 times said there was no fraud. But that's not true. I mean, the court basically didn't hear most of these cases. The few they did hear, I think they wrongly decided that secretaries of state could do what they wanted. But the vast majority of the time, these were turned down for standing, and fraud was never examined. So I think we'll never know the actual degree of fraud. But for those who say it's already been studied and there's nothing to see here, are basically refusing to look at it. But the good news is, in quite a few Republican state legislatures, we are looking at that. I pushed it in my state, and we passed it in our state. And so we are trying to bring back integrity, and our voters want it, because our voters don't want to put all the effort into running and working for an election, and then to find out that they can't believe in the honesty of it. So I think, yes, it was an extraordinary election, and yes, we do need reform. And I've been a big proponent of the state legislatures looking at this.
Well, and thank you so much for that leadership. It was in early January, Senator Paul, when I was listening on the radio to your interview on Fox News, and the day of or the day after the January 6th incident at the Capitol, And leading the nation's largest state-based think tank, I was struck by your emphasis on what those of us who've read the Constitution and understand it know is true. And that is, when it comes to elections, most of the authority lay with state legislatures. And that's a theme that I really want to emphasize in our conversation because it's so important to you as it is for the Texas Public Policy Foundation. But before getting to that, I know that a lot of our viewers, whether they're in Texas or outside Texas, I'm sure we have some tuning in from Kentucky, they're curious. In fact, they might be concerned about the status of the misnamed For the People Act now in the Senate. And I'm hopeful that here at the beginning of the week, you can give us a sense of where that stands in the Senate.
You know, historically, our elections, both local, state, and federal elections, were basically, decided by the states. The states wrote the rules. Time, place, and manner was, for the state legislature's prerogative. Now, the Constitution is a little confusing in that it does give Congress a role if there's a problem. But historically, the understanding was that states were the ones and the arbiters who would write the rules within certain boundaries. The problem is that there are some now who say, well, we want to completely federalize this and take it away from the states completely. So this is Nancy Pelosi's bill. And this bill basically would federalize the elections, get rid of any kind of ID requirements. Everything would be mail in. It's sort of the opposite of everything Republicans want. But it could also transform the country into basically a place where it's very, very hard to, verify the person who's actually voting, and where vote harvesting becomes the norm, not the exception. And then we will have elections like they do in California, or like the presidential last time, where we appear to be leading, we're leading, it gets to midnight, and then drip by drip, they keep finding votes and keep harvesting the votes until they get it. And there's sort of an unseemly nature to it. Even if it were completely honest, it's sort of like, oh my goodness, where are these votes coming from? So you can see how doubt creeps up immediately. But so I think for constitutional reasons, we should fix this at the state, not in Congress. But I also think that from a practical point of view, we have the chance to change the state legislatures have the chance to change election law, and maybe, I don't know, 25 or 30 state legislatures that we control. And we've done it in Kentucky, even though we had to overcome the veto of our governor. But our governor is weak in the sense that 51% vote can overcome the governor. And so we promptly did. He vetoed it and we overcame his veto. But yeah, this is really important. People are interested in the U.S. Senate. The only way the U.S. Senate we have a chance in 2022 is if we prevent this harvesting of ballots.
Yeah, it's so crucial for folks tuning in who are curious about, say, the state of the filibuster, to understand that what we're doing in legislative sessions across this country is pivotal. You've mentioned Kentucky. Obviously, the legislature that's probably gotten the most attention the last couple of weeks is Georgia's. They passed a very good election reform bill in a lot of respects here in Texas. And this is sort of where I'm driving with this question, Senator. Here in Texas, our legislature has taken the first few of what will need to be a few more steps toward a really great election reform law. We're zealously focused on one more provision becoming law, and that is ensuring that voter verification, Georgia style, happens for mail-in ballots. Whether it's that provision or other provisions you've been working on state by state with the American Legislative Exchange Council, what would you recommend to people in whatever state they're in that they pass along to their legislators as specific provisions that states need to implement in order to ensure election integrity?
I think that absentee voting needs to be individualized. What I mean by that is MoveOn.org nor the NRA should be able to get thousands of, or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of addresses and mail to them the application. If you want to apply for a ballot, it needs to be individualized by the individual going to vote with their information. Now, you could foresee like a family member helping or a caregiver helping them to get access if they can't get access through the computer easily. But what we don't want is MoveOn.org mails 1 million Georgians, and then they mail them again and again and again. Then they go to their house and they collect 1 million votes. They take it down, and all of a sudden the election turns out in an unusual way. I think the Georgia law prevents that. I think our Kentucky law prevents that. The other thing you have to consider is recalcitrant or rebellious county officials. You have a county there called Travis County that I'm sure you're aware of and that you're in right now. And Travis County is sort of like maybe a communist oasis in the middle of conservative Texas, but you don't want local officials in Travis County or Harris County or any of the cities to be able to override or overrule state legislative law on elections. This is a big deal because, like what happened in Wisconsin was they set up a local election commission, and the local election commission just ignored all the law. They ended up curing ballots that had only a name on it. Typically, if you had only a name and you didn't put your address, it just didn't count, frankly, because you have to meet some standards. And so what happened, and I think this is important and looking forward, is to make sure that the state law says counties cannot contradict and do things on their own that contradict the law. Same with secretaries of state. You need to make sure your secretary of state or your governor, even if it's a Republican now and you are confident they wouldn't do it, you need to make sure from here forward that no governor or secretary of state can decide just on their own to mail ballots to people. This happened across the country. And this is where you get into the mischief problem. And so I think these are important things as you look at your legislature that you have to codify. You shouldn't have to tell people what they can't do, but because the courts are now ruling in this upside down fashion that the Secretary of State can do anything if you haven't proscribed or prohibited that behavior, you may have to even put into the law what they can't do instead of just putting into the law what they can do.
No, that's an excellent point. I'm sure a lot of folks watching today are monitoring the election reform debate in their legislatures right now. I can tell you here in Texas that it is one of the live wire issues. And of course, the rhetoric from the left is baseless. It's just inaccurate. That's the most terrible way I can put it. But we're constantly being told that those of us who want to protect every vote, regardless of for whom the voter is voting, whichever party they're voting for, that we're racist or somehow trying to suppress the vote. And we're even hearing that from some woke corporations. Before we turn to a couple of audience questions, Senator, what would your response to those charges be? And really what I'm looking for on behalf of our audience is you're really good at framing the debate on our terms. How can we reframe the debate on our terms in a way that helps this legislation become law?
I would remind people that the Republican Party got the vote and citizenship for African Americans when no Democrat supported it. When the Jim Crow laws came around in the South, not one Republican voted for them. This is the history of the Democrat Party. In fact, the Democrat Party should apologize for the Jim Crow laws. They should apologize for their association with KKK. All the horrific things in our country's history were Democrats. The people beating John Lewis as he's coming across the bridge in Selma, they're all Democrats. To a person, they're Democrats. There were no Republicans on the bridge at Selma. So we can't just let these people paint a picture that all of a sudden we're the ones. We are the champions of voting rights. The NAACP was founded by Black Republicans. In my state, in 1917, the first case to overturn Democrat enforced segregation was William Worley versus Buchanan. William Worley was a Black Republican who founded the NAACP in Louisville. So our history is one of voting rights. None of these bills infringes on voting rights. And for the last decade or more, African Americans have been voting at the same percentage as whites or higher. That's why the Supreme Court lifted these extra controls that they had on southern states, because in Mississippi now, Blacks voted a higher percentage than whites. So the people trying to paint this are ridiculously uninformed. The corporations, the only way they'll reform themselves is you should quit buying their products, quit drinking Coke, quit flying Delta if you can, and quit watching Major League Baseball. If they're going to say they don't care for Republicans to watch their sports, so be it. We'll see what happens. This is happening in a lot of sports as they become very radicalized. That's fine. If they don't want Republicans to watch, call us racist and watch us no longer come to their games.
Amen. And I hear, as I'm sure you do, Senator, some folks out in the country saying that our elected officials just don't have enough courage in pushing back on corporations. I've seen, maybe for the first time in my lifetime, a growing number of conservative leaders doing that. You've done that, I would say, your entire career. But I think the reason they're doing that is because more of us are willing to say, we're not going to fly Delta. We're not flying American Airlines. We've canceled our Major League Baseball subscription. And I think those of you who are in elective office, of course, respond to that. And, de Tocqueville would remind us of that our leaders will exhibit the virtue that we ourselves have as voters. So that's probably a good segue to the first of two audience questions we'll get to, Senator. Thanks for making time for that. And the first of them is from an audience member who asks, is there anything that can be done in Democrat-controlled states? What sort of litigation, for example, might be successful in those places?
Work for the next election to make them not Democrat states is probably the most practical thing. I don't know that I'm expert enough to give you the legal advice on whether or not people can sue in those states over voting laws. In all likelihood, those probably won't be successful. I think really what you have to do is organize. People forget, how important their state representative is and their state senator is. But it makes a difference even at the federal level. If you're concerned about who your U.S. senator is, you'll only win in Georgia if you keep control of the state legislature and we keep the elections honest. So this is something where most people don't realize it, but you can call your state representative. You can find them and probably talk to them in person. You may know them. They may go to your church. The districts aren't that big usually. Now, the state Senate is a little bigger. In Texas, they're actually bigger districts than Congress. So it might be harder to find your state senator, but I would communicate with them that you want election reform. If you live in a Democrat state, find out who your state rep is. If it's a Democrat, talk to them anyway. But you might also look and say, well, he only won or she only won with 52% of the vote. Then the Republicans need to make sure they jump in these races. There's also historically a lot of these races are unopposed. Let's get in all these races. Let's grow the party. I saw a wonderful video of an African-American woman, I think it's Kathy Barnett in Pennsylvania running, and I was amazed by the video. And, you have to watch the video. It's just so amazing to see how many great African-American candidates we have. In my state, the first African-American lieutenant governor was a Republican, elected about 4 years ago. First attorney general, African-American, also Republican. So we're making history in Kentucky. And I think in a lot of states, that's the way ultimately we win. You can win Illinois again if you get 15 to 20% of the African-American vote. 5% doesn't do it. We have to start growing our African-American vote in these cities and these states that have big dominant populations in their cities. But I think it's doable. And I think the history of our party is one that people just think, oh, it's just history, don't mention it. No, we should mention the terrible history, and Democrats should be made to apologize. People want to apologize for stuff that happened a while ago. Democrats should be first in line to apologize for Jim Crow, apologize for their association with the KKK, and apologize for opposing everything that allowed Black Americans to vote from the Civil War on.
No, that's right. And it sort of takes this conversation full circle, because being on offense, if you will, rhetorically, is also historically accurate in this case. It's really the left that has a lot to answer for, as opposed to those of us who are conservative reformers on this issue. Senator, one more question from the audience before I pitch to you the question I ask all of our guests on this. And the question member from the audience is, what's your prediction on whether the filibuster will hold on the election reform bill or the election bill that the Democrats are pushing?
It's completely dependent on two people, Manchin and Sinema in the Senate. No Republican will vote to get rid of the filibuster. And I think the filibuster is incredibly important. In the history of our country, there have been many more bad ideas than good ideas. Most people want to take away freedom, not give it back. The protection of liberty is not always the most popular of ideas. So it's Manchin and Sinema. I saw them playing a clip again, I think a recent clip of Manchin saying he will not vote to pack the Supreme Court and he will not vote to get rid of the filibuster. Boy, if he remains courageous and does that, and I think that's actually what the people in West Virginia would want him to do, we'll manage till 2022. I think in 2022, there's better than 50% chance the Republicans take the House, because Texas is going to pick up 3 seats, Florida's picking up 2 seats, and through redistricting and drawing the lines, there may be some more advantages for Republicans to pick up a few more. But people continue to flee high tax states to go to low tax states. And as they do, it's helping us in Congress. So I think better than 50% chance we win Congress. And in the Senate, I'd probably say 50-50. And some of that depends on us working very hard in places like Georgia.
Yes, thank you. Well, I appreciate your time. One more question for you that I started asking about a year ago of every guest. when we started this live stream amid COVID, and I would argue more importantly, the shutdowns and sort of this year of disaffectiveness by Americans of all sides, of all ideologies. And that is, in spite of all those challenges we've experienced in the last 15 months or so, why did you wake up this morning optimistic about America's future?
I'm a big believer in the ideas of progress, of human progress. There's a website called humanprogress.org that I follow. And if you look at the population worldwide before 1820, beginning of the Industrial Revolution, 98% of people lived in extreme poverty, less than $2 a day using current dollars. You fast forward to when I was born in the early 1960s, less than a third of the people lived in extreme poverty, less than $2 a day. Fast forward to where we are now, less than 10% of the world, not just the US, of the world. If you look at purchase of food, you can buy 7 times as much food for the same amount of dollars as you could 100 years ago. You look at how many average worker hours it took to buy a refrigerator, over 100 hours in the 1950s. It's probably 10, 15 hours now. So productivity and progress and wealth have been enormous. And so people who are always saying things are so terrible, they just don't get it. But once we understand and can agree that things are getting better and have been for a long time, we have to understand what created that. And it's not automatic. It doesn't come just without any effort. It comes from capitalism, freedom, comes from trade, and it comes from the division of labor, all the things Adam Smith talked about. And it can continue, but we have to look at the cautionary tales of Venezuela. We have to look at what Zimbabwe did to their money. And I'm very worried we are spending so much and borrowing it so quickly that I have become more and more concerned with each day that we're going to really destroy our currency if we're not careful. So I continue to push even against Republicans who want to spend too much. And but that being said, what a great country we have. And it's the thing we have to not give up on. Let these people say, oh, it's a terrible racist country. We're not. We are a country that's gotten better decade after decade, not only through great wealth, but I think also through better interactions. I think actually there's less racism in our country than at any point in time in our history. Now, there are people dwelling on race and there's violence in the cities now, but really I think in individual human-to-human reaction, in employment, law school, med school, college entrance, there is no institutional impediments to getting ahead in our country. Are there things we should fix with the police? Sure, I'm for police reform. But I think we shouldn't paint with a broad brush that we're a terrible country. I think we're a great country and we'll remain that if we remember what made us great, and that was capitalism.
Well, that's right. As I say often, Senator, you can't love what you don't know. And a lot of it just starts with good information, whether it's the website you mentioned or what we're teaching in our K through 12 classrooms or our university classrooms for that matter. Let me say as we wrap up, Senator, thanks so much for making time for this today. And I know I can speak on behalf of our audience that we're grateful for everything you've done on this issue of election reforms, and for that matter, all of those issues that keep America humming along as the great engine of prosperity and opportunity for the world. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, thanks for joining us. To those of you in the audience, thanks so much for making time for this today. May the Lord continue to prosper the work of your hands. Take care.
Thank you.